overwhelmingly almost all Republican.
Yes. Yeah, gerrymandering is a function of the winner-take-all system, and it's also the reason why we had robocalls back in 2011. They're playing with getting just enough voters in certain ridings. They look to the swing ridings. This is the other thing that is a problem. There's very few ridings that actually determine the election. I mean, in Canada, you've got over 50% of the ridings are what's called safe ridings that really never change hands. So, I mean, the election was determined by very few ridings. In 2011, they decided, somebody did the calculations, they thought the election was determined by 14 ridings. So that's all a function of monkeying around with votes within a particular riding, and which is something that PR really, you get around a lot of that. I mean, you may still have, to the extent you have riding boundaries, you may still have potential for that, but it gets rid of a lot of that problem. Yep. Okay, can I go on to the next? Okay, now one of the things that people will tell you is that under a proportional system, the governments are not stable. It very seldom under a proportional system will you get a single party majority. Usually you have 3 or 4 main parties, vote splits amongst them, and you will not have a single party getting over 50%. So people look at that and say, whoa, we've got all these minority governments, it's not going to be stable. Well, in fact, first past the post, particularly in Canada, has proven to be a lot less stable than most PR countries. And the reason for that is that minority governments under first past the post are very volatile. Parties are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting to trigger an election when they think they're going to get a majority. Under proportional representation, there's not the same incentive to have an election. I mean, if you're always going to be part of a coalition, having an election means that you're going to shift the coalitions around a bit. You're never going to get control of the government. So there's not the same incentives. And you also have much more continuity from one government to the next under proportional representation. I mean, you may shift who the lead coalition partner is, but whoever was in government before is probably going to be in government in some capacity afterwards. It'll be the same sorts of coalitions. So in fact, when you look at the number of elections since World War II, and Canada has had quite a few minority governments. Canada's had 22 elections, Ireland's had 19, Germany 18, Switzerland 18, even Italy, one that people compare Canada to quite a bit. I think it's not up there, but I think it's around 18 elections. So first past the post, particularly in Canada, because we have more than 2 parties, has tended to be quite volatile, actually. Oh, there's Italy there.
17, you're close.
Pardon?
17, you were close.
Yes. I think it was in that range.
That's not the same as the number of governments.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
No, that's right.
For each election, Italy might have 5 different governments.
Yeah, there's a lot more of these.
Italy is a problem child. They're not even proportional anymore. They keep monkeying around with their system. They bump up the one party with the bonus votes on top of it. They monkeyed around with it. So
They had a referendum in Italy 2 or 3 months ago that the government lost, and my understanding is that they were trying to reduce the number of seats in parliament. I have no idea about the details, but would that, I don't know much about Italy, but would that have been a move away from proportional representation?
I think it was a move away from proportionality, and I think it had more to do with the Senate maybe than with the lower house. I don't know all the details. But
My understanding is that they had a very large parliament, that it was so large for proportionality that it was unwieldy at a certain point.
they've changed their electoral system several times. I mean, countries that change their electoral system every other election. There's usually something up that's not quite right, and then Italy's one. The other problem child people talk about is Israel. Israel has pure proportionality. They have a lot of parties. They kind of have their own special problems as well. But most of these countries that we're looking at, the OECD countries, are largely all very stable and are doing very well.
So let's put the USA up there, they have an election every 2 years. Right, so they must have had.
Well, they have fixed elections.
It's constitutional.
Pardon?
The US system is constitutionally, it's not when the government falls.
That's right, yes, they don't have governments that fall, they're a two-party system as well, so, it's either or sort of, so they're quite stable. But the thing that, first past the post, because of this volatility and the swing from one government to the next, where you don't have the continuity, where you're always, throwing out what the last guy did, is that we suffer largely from policy which. It's hard to make progress if every time you get a new government, you're throwing out what the last one did and replacing it with something. So the continuity in the countries that have PR, on the whole, on many measures, proportional countries have better results on many measures. And a lot of it's attributed to the continuity. And also, if you're part of the government beforehand and you agree to certain policies, even though you might be a minority player in the next government or something, you were part of that government that, developed that policy. And so you're not likely to be objecting to it if you're in opposition after the next government. And also because you have, so I was talking about before, you're not going to have a single party majority, but what you do have under proportional representation is a multi-party majority. That's what you normally get with PR, are multi-party coalitions that represent a true majority. So you have, whenever you're developing policy, you've got parties that represent a true majority that are supporting those policies. Okay, alternative vote. As I mentioned, this is another winner-take-all system. Basically, you just add a ranked ballot to the first-past-the-post system. Unfortunately, it doesn't really fix first-past-the-post. You're still bound by those boundaries. And there's only so much you can do within the boundaries of that writing. And adding a ranked ballot doesn't help. And in particular, we've had both alternative vote and STV have been used fairly extensively in Western provinces, like Alberta, Manitoba, BC, have all experimented with alternative vote and STV. So in some cases, like for 50 years. So we have a fair bit of history of AV and STV in Canada. And as I mentioned, Australia is really the only country now that currently uses it for its national elections. And what you get, in Canada, there was an expert that testified at the Electoral Reform Committee who said Canada's experience is that the results under alternative vote were the same as first past the post 98% of the time. Which kind of makes sense because, after you count your ballots, you've got a front runner. The front runner is going to need fewer votes the next time around in order to beat the rest. So the rest are then always falling behind. So in the case, unless you're talking about a very close election, the front runner is always going to take the riding. So it's virtually first past the post. When you have optional preferences, which is what Canada has used, where you can rank as many as few as one or as many as you want, you end up with a lot of exhausted ballots. So if you have a lot of people that only make one selection, well, that's first past the post, and you end up with exhausted ballots, and then after a count, there's ballots that have already been used up. Either the candidate has been dropped off or whatever. So when they say that you end up with an MP with the support of 50% of the voters, that's not actually quite true in most cases. You have so many exhausted ballots, they're talking about 50% of the ballots that are left after you remove the exhausted ballots. So, I don't know what else. You had questions about ED?
No, when you said that out west, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, I think, experimented with alternative vote. I called it instant runoff.
Yeah.
When did they get rid of that to return to first past the post and why? I didn't know that.
Okay, I think, dates, it goes back to the 50s and 60s. I mean, when I say 50 years, it was probably the first half of the 1900s mostly. Governments do not change voting systems except to suit themselves. And so where you had STV, governments come in and decided that system wasn't really working for them, so they changed it. And AD would probably have been the same reason.
Well, I would think that with the alternative vote is something that can be more effectively or efficient in present times with computerized voting than they would in, let's say, 50 years ago, where everything had to be counted by hand. And after you have, let's say, if the first count didn't work, you probably have to recount everything to recount. So it would seem as if maybe back in the, let's say, the first half, they might have abandoned it just because it was so cumbersome to count it.
I've never really heard that reason. I mean, that's possible.
I'm just speculating that that would be a
I just-
reasonable explanation.
It boils down to the government didn't think it was to their benefit and they got rid of it. And so we've had quite a number of changes in electoral systems in the provinces and no referendum. I mean, the government just basically changed it. Okay, okay, so this is what a ranked ballot looks like. I mean, it would be your existing ballot, basically, with one candidate per party, and you're just going to rank it. And then what happens is you count and you drop off the lowest, whoever the candidate that got the lowest, and then you take their second and third choices and you reallocate them. Is basically how it happens until you end up with one of the candidates has more than 50% of the votes. Ranked ballot has been used quite extensively in U.S. municipalities. There are some arguments for using it in municipal elections where there's no parties that might be beneficial. It also gets pushed by companies selling voting machines in the U.S. And there's quite a few municipalities there that are actually going back to first past the post when they realized they were getting elected officials that really didn't have 50% of the vote. It wasn't much different than what they were getting in the first past the post. Anybody else have any questions about alternate vote?
There was a lot of speculation early on in the 2015 campaign that that system would have prevented a conservative minority from being elected because the Liberal and NDP combined vote would likely to swamp it. So there probably are circumstances in which it would make a difference, but yeah, I understand that most analyses say that it really doesn't make much difference.
No, it doesn't usually make, and a lot of people that don't like the Conservatives will cite that as a reason for a ranked ballot, too, is to keep out the Conservatives forever and ever.
That could work the other way.
And I think some of the projections, CBC was making some projections based on, what people stated their second preferences were, and they were giving the Liberals way more votes. So this is the other thing that you will see happen sometimes, not always, is that, if there's a big swing. And part of that is because, you're taking, they say, oh, well, you get to vote NDP in the riding that elected an NDP. Well, your second vote is then probably Liberal, right?
I have some
So
good news
you're
here.
not a front runner, your first vote drops off, and so you end up padding the second runner's votes, right, in that
And
case.
some bad news.
Oh,
Let's stop. No, you don't have to stop all over, but I think
There's something-
you missed something.
There's something to be said though for the psychological effect. Like, for instance, in my riding, which is Aaron Mills, I don't know what riding, but elected a Liberal. But a lot of people would have preferred to cast a vote for NDP, even though it was wasted. They would have felt better under that.
yes, well, they're placebo votes,
Yes,
yes. And there's no doubt about it, I mean, the problem with first past the post is strategic voting.
Yeah.
And people, well, there's a lot of people who voted for the Liberals that didn't like the Conservatives, and they looked to see who was most likely to win in that riding, even though they preferred someone else. So it is quite possible, you know, that the NDP can end up with more seats in those ridings where, you know, they have strong support.
No, so-
But,
I think it's unlikely. I was just arguing that
yeah,
in the straight facts, there's also the psychological benefit that more people are going to go out and participate.
until they realize that,
Because
yeah.
they think that their vote counts. In fact, it does.